nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Mythology. This is where we talk about a little bit from mythology. That's super fucked up, but really what mythology isn't. Happy Valentine's Day. So when I originally wrote this script, I was planning on saying Happy New Year, but it's 6 weeks in and I haven't written anything or uploaded anything until now because your girl got COVID. Even though I barely leave my house and barely interact with people, and yet my son, who goes to a school filled with kid germs, and my husband, who is a teacher who goes to a school filled with kid germs, we're both fine. Barely any symptoms. And me, the one who talks to no one and considers that a good day, was out of commission for weeks because life is a cosmic joke full of eternal suffering, but the horrors persist, and so do I. So as I was laid up in bed between reading mediocre books that did not live up to the expectations of the first book in the series, I took a break to think about everything. So one thing is kind of related to the reading of mediocre books. I am very excited to tell you all about a new project that I will be starting this year. So for probably about the last 2 years now or so, I've been playing with the idea of starting a second podcast. So for any of you who don't know, or maybe any new listeners, in December, I completed my master's in history. I specialize in the early modern witch hunts, especially the ones in England, but the one in the American colonies are also something that I specialize in, especially considering I live in Salem, Massachusetts, and I own my own tour company where we talk about the witch trials. But my undergrad that I graduated from many moons ago was actually in English literary studies. I was an English major, which I'm sure surprises very few people that I was an English major. Just I'm sure they're totally surprised when I say I was a theater kid in high school. So this new project is called Regrets, where I talk about books and if I regret reading them or if I regret waiting to read it. I've somehow convinced my husband to come on some episodes as well, because whenever I read these books, I always end up telling him about them. And he was the one a year and a half, 2 years ago, who was like, hey, you like podcasting. Why don't you start another podcast about books so you can talk to other people about it? But he loves me for some reason. So I am still going to have him involved. I don't know if he's going to be involved in every episode, if he's just going to be on some episodes. But it's kind of a fun new thing that we're doing. I just finished scripting the first episode and we'll be recording it this week. So whenever it comes out, I will link it in the description, and I would love for any of you to come over and give it a listen, especially if you do like the way that I tell mythologies on this channel, because it's pretty much more of that, just books instead of myths. The first book I'm doing is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, because I have opinions, which I'm sure also surprises nobody. I also spent a lot of time thinking about this podcast and where I want to go with it. And I'm going to do something pretty exciting this year, and I'm going to bring in some people to have conversations with, especially about topics that they are experts in, because I am, I have ADHD and probably a touch of the tism, and I tend to go down rabbit holes and try to learn everything that I can. But typically going down rabbit holes and learning everything that you can on a time limit when you're doing a podcast episode, you're not going to get everything. You're not going to know all the nuances. You're not going to know all the nitty-gritty details. And that matters. And bringing in experts who are people who are specializing in some of these histories will only make us all learn more. So the first one will be in a couple weeks. I'm bringing my friend Lindsay on to talk about a history that's local to where she is. We actually already met up, unfortunately over Zoom because I was sick. We went up over Zoom to record that episode, which will come out probably at the end of the month, about a massacre or a raid, and the terminology and the reasoning why that terminology is so kind of disputed right now. That happened over where she is in Western Mass. I also recently just got connected with someone named Shay, who has a podcast called Rainy Day Rabbit Holes, which she does with her co-host Jody. And it's all about history of the Pacific Northwest. But they have a similar vibe to me and the way that like I tell my history as well. So I've listened to specifically their episode about the Japanese internment camps, which I obviously knew of, but I didn't know a lot about, and I really enjoyed it. And in maybe March we're going to do an episode together. I'm going to put their information in the description. If you're listening on Spotify, there's also like a tab that says like the more like this that's on the homepage, where I can put some podcasts that I recommend, and it's also there as well. When I asked Shay to sort of like describe her and her co-host and their podcast, she said they are two Pacific Northwest ladies who are super hot and don't look a day over 35, who get into the interesting, weird, and wacky histories of the Pacific Northwest. She described their show as a combination of interesting, semi-accurate history and grade level humor. She called herself the finest Google scholar, which I am also a holder of that honorary Google degree. On their podcast, they love to talk about the weird and wacky history and are a sucker for all things effed up, as am I. So in case you're looking for another history podcast full of weirdness and vibes, make sure you check out the Rainy Day Rabbit Holes podcast and keep an ear out for our collab episode, hopefully coming up within the next like month or so. I also reflected where I've already gone with this podcast and where I want to go with future episodes I'll be doing on my own. Listen, I had a lot of downtime when I was sick, and the light coming from the TV was too loud, and I know that you know what I mean by that. So almost a year ago, back in March, before I took my break and then like came back to upload 2 episodes only to take another break and then to like love bomb you with 12 consecutive episodes about cryptids while simultaneously also trying to finish my last semester of my master's degree because I have wonderful priorities before then taking like another 8-week break, I received an email from a listener named Clarissa who requested that I do Medusa. And since it is Valentine's Day, I figured this would be the best time because I fucking love Medusa. I have always loved Medusa. When I was younger, some of my friends actually would jokingly call me Medusa because if you'd ever seen me, I have curly hair, and when it's windy, it just kind of like flies all over the place. And they would jokingly say that it was like my hair was alive, like Medusa's hair. And I took that as a compliment, the highest of compliments. Thank you. I also have an old coin, at least I was told was very old when I purchased it online. Who actually knows though at the end of the day? I'm a historian, I'm not an archaeologist. And I turned it into a necklace, and I literally wear it all the time. Like I am wearing it right now. It's really cute. So it's Medusa, but it kind of also looks like a sunflower. And then on the back of it is Nike. And so I always have like the Medusa side facing out, but also like on the inside, the goddess of victory is pretty fucking cool to have like close to your heart, to give you like inspiration when things suck. I'm also like possibly planning on getting a Medusa tattoo later on this year. I don't know. It's something I'll kind of talk about towards the end of the podcast, and the issue that I have with like Medusa tattoos nowadays. She is one of my favorite myths though, and I've been wanting to do her story for a really long time, but I've always kind of just like put it off because there are a lot of different versions that I've had to read through, and like no one seems to be on the same page, and there are a lot of studies that have been done about her that we'll talk about. Shout out to the book The Medusa Reader, which compiled most of these together and made my job a heck of a lot easier. But because there are all these versions, she has become very divisive. A big part of many of these versions is sexual assault, and yet there are people who say that sometimes the language used doesn't say directly that she was raped. Or like in this one specific version, it was consensual, which I honestly disagree with wholeheartedly based on my knowledge of the specific Olympian involved and how they work. There are also people who think that her being changed into what she becomes was a mercy, which I also disagree with wholeheartedly based on my knowledge of the specific Olympian involved and how they work. And I've discussed this like a million times. I feel like every time I do a mythology episode, I talk about how there are so many different versions of myths and interpretations of myths and translations that are biased or translate in ways to fit whatever narrative that the author is trying to construct. And usually that's fine. Usually people don't have an issue when you choose this specific version for a myth as opposed to that specific version for a myth. But for some reason, people get really heckin' mad when you say something that they don't agree with when it comes to Medusa. And I think a lot of that comes to like what Medusa symbolizes nowadays, which we'll talk about, and how like women are taking that back in an overall like hatred of women and things that women like that factor into it, because it's typically men who are saying this. And again, I say this negatively sounding. I'm not a misandrist. I think that men are cool. I think that individual men are fantastic. I'm married to a man. I have a son. I'm raising him to be a man that will be someone that your daughter can be comfortable about growing up, or your son can be comfortable around growing up, or anyone can be comfortable around growing up. So I have no problem with man. I have a problem with men, copyright, trademark, sign, right? Like the overall people who are on the internet saying the things that they say, the Andrew Tates and the red pillars and all of these kinds of things, who hear women talking about things that they like, talking about books that they like, talking about mythology that they like, talking about fashion that they like, or claiming something for their own and what it symbolizes, and then it becoming something that is a point of contention. And I do believe that that is possibly a part of the Medusa myth and why she has so many disagreements. And in the first couple years of me doing this podcast, I still cared about what people thought, but I don't anymore. So I mean, anyone who's listened to me to more than one of my episodes knows I am opinionated. In case you haven't heard in the 10 minutes or so that I've been talking so far. So my plan for this episode is to talk about a lot of that. Okay, I'm not going to just do the myth. We're going to have a whole conversation. Well, I mean, I say conversation, but like it's going to be mostly me talking at you about all these things and talk about the different stories of Medusa and the different interpretations of Medusa and how some of them have evolved over time. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I will be here for hours and hours and hours if I do that, but I will talk about like the big ones that people kind of know and think about and talk about. So in history, this is called historiography, and that is where you look at how historians have looked at these like different historical events or ideas over time and how they change. And that's kind of what I'm going to do for this. I'm assuming in classical studies there is a version of this, but I am not a classics major. So for all intents and purposes, I am calling this a mythography. And thank you, Clarissa, for requesting this. And I hope that you like how I do this. And I hope like your last semester of school is going to be going well for you. Solidarity with this. I know how hard the struggle is. And if one of you are listening and you don't like how I do this episode and you don't like all of the things that I'm going to bring into it and all my opinions that I'm going to bring into it, go start your own podcast. I even have a link in my description where you will get a discount if you want to start your own podcast. Click on that link. I get a kickback. You get a kickback. Everyone is happy. I will gladly listen to this podcast. Hell, I'll come on and collab on your podcast and we can have a debate over Medusa and why we think she is the way she is and why I say this and you say that. I will happily do this. I will happily friendly debate with you about it. And if you don't want to do that, message me. Send me a message literally anywhere and we can discuss this and you can tell me how wrong I am because I look forward to it. I like being told that I'm wrong and I like telling other people that they're wrong. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your, oh good God, what the fuck faces. Marjorie Garber and Nancy J. Vickers, authors of The Medusa Reader, which was probably my main source material for this episode, say, quote, "Poets have called Medusa a muse. Feminists have adopted her as a sign of powerful womanhood. Anthropologists read her image as embedded in the paradoxical logic of amulets, talismans, and relics. Psychoanalysts have understood the serpents wreathing her head as a symbol of fear of castration. Political theorists have cast her as a figure for revolt. Artists have painted her in moods from sublime to horrific. The most canonical writers have invoked her story and sung of her praise and her blame. The most adventurous of postmodern designers and performers see her as a model, a logo, and a figure of the present age. From distant beginnings, the story of Medusa has fascinated listeners and readers and terrified them. For what is most compelling in the long history of the myth and its retellings is Medusa's intrinsic doubleness, at once monster and beauty, disease and cure, threat and protection, poison and remedy. So let's kind of just like go off the cuff at the beginning and just quickly say the Medusa myth as most people have accepted it. Okay. Medusa's parents were Phorcys and Keto. She had many siblings, the Hesperides, Steno, Euryale, the Graiae, Thusa, Scylla, and Ladon. Scylla we've kind of talked about before when we did the Odysseus myth. But her main sisters that she's often linked with are Steno and Euryale, right? The three of them together make the Gorgons. For some reason, Medusa is the only one of those three who is mortal. She is the only one of those three that can die for some reason. It's never really explained in the myths, but Medusa is mortal. In addition to Medusa being mortal, she is also beautiful. She is so beautiful that with a single look, men are captivated by her. Her face, her hair especially, she is known far and wide for how beautiful her hair is. But she's not interested in men. She's not interested in any sort of love. She becomes a priestess of Athena. Athena is a virgin goddess. She is the goddess of war and wisdom, and Medusa becomes her most ardent and devoted follower. But because she was beautiful, men lusted after her. Men wanted her. Gods wanted her. And one day, the god Poseidon, god of the sea, the ocean, etc., decided that he wanted Medusa, that he would be the one to win over Medusa. And while she was in Athena's temple, Poseidon came to her and he raped her at the foot of the statue of Athena. And when he was finished, he left her. And when he left her, Athena came to her. And Athena was so angered, not by what Poseidon did to Medusa, but what Medusa did in being sexually assaulted, that she punished her for it. Now, this is something that you see commonly in mythology. Oftentimes, women are punished for being sexually assaulted by gods. There's another big myth that comes to mind immediately, which is the myth of Artemis and Callisto. And Callisto was in love with Artemis. Callisto was a devoted follower of Artemis, who is also a virgin goddess. And when Zeus turned himself into Artemis and seduced Callisto, she was punished for it. And she was turned into a bear after being expelled from Artemis's hunting group because of something that she had no control over, something that was done to her, and yet she is the one who's punished for it. And this is the same thing that you see in the Medusa myth. This is something that was done to her, and yet she is punished for it. And Athena takes the beauty of Medusa. She takes her hair that is known far and wide, and she turns it into serpents. She takes her beautiful face and she distorts it. She takes the gaze that she has that can stop men in their tracks, and she curses her to turn all people that she gazes upon to stone. Medusa then goes into hiding. She goes on to a deserted island where men come and try to claim her, where men come and try to hurt her or kill her. And she uses her curse to turn all of these men to stone. She becomes a legend in her own right. She becomes something that especially men want to overcome. They want to possess. They want to kill and take her for what she is, right? Pause and shift over to a man named Perseus. Perseus is the son of Danae and Zeus. Now, the story of Perseus's conception is always an interesting one. So, King Acrisius of Argos had one child named Danae, and he was told by the Oracle of Delphi that he would one day be killed by his grandson. Danae is his only child, so in a way to avert that and to keep her childless, he locks her in a tower and says that nobody can get to her and that nobody can do anything, right? However, Zeus, in all of his Zeusness, a tower is not going to keep him away. So he comes to Danae in the form of a golden shower. And she becomes pregnant from this golden shower. Soon after their son is born, and in fear, Acrisius puts the two of them into a wooden chest and casts them into the sea and to die. Like, the intention is to kill them. But Danae prays and, does her thing. And she washes ashore on the island of Seriphos. They are taken in by a man named Dictys, who becomes sort of like a father figure to Perseus and raises him. Except that as Perseus is grown, Dictys's brother Polydectes becomes king of the island, and he has his eye on Danae. He wants to marry her. And when they go about having the wedding, everyone brings wedding gifts. He requests that all of the guests bring horses. Except Perseus doesn't have a horse to give. And so in sort of like a shame, Perseus says, just name whatever gift that you would like, and I will retrieve it for you. And Polydectes wants to get Perseus out of the picture. Perseus is a threat. Perseus is strong. Perseus is a handsome young man. Perseus doesn't want Danae to marry Polydectes and is kind of standing in the way of that. So Polydectes requests that Perseus goes and retrieves Medusa's head. That is a suicide mission. You are sending your future wife's son to die, pretty much, because no one who sets out to retrieve the Gorgon's head returns, ever. And Perseus knows this. So as he's heading off on his quest, he prays to Zeus. And in response, Zeus sends two of his children to him, Hermes and Athena. Hermes gives Perseus his winged sandals so that he can go on his quest. And he also loans him a sword to slay Medusa with. Athena gives him a polished shield that he can use and kind of advises him to not look directly at Medusa, to use the shield like a mirror so that way he doesn't get turned to stone. She also gives him a sack that will like safely contain the Gorgon's head after she is killed, and kind of warns him that even after death, she can still have the ability to turn people to stone. He goes to the Graii, which were the Gorgon sisters. These were, you see them in like the Hercules myth, the Hercules movie, the Disney Hercules animated classic. They're the ones that like each share an eye, and they're kind of conflated with fate sometimes. So he finds them and he kind of like threatens to kill them. He takes their eye that they share and refuses to give it back unless they tell the location of Medusa. And he finds the island of Sarpedon, which is where Medusa has taken refuge. He arrives while Medusa is sleeping. He uses the shield to get into the cave, just like he's instructed by Athena. And while she is sleeping, he beheads Medusa, and Athena guides his sword. And from the decapitated body of Medusa comes the winged horse Pegasus, which you also see in the animated classic Hercules, and also Chrysaor, which is he becomes this grand warrior. He is able to escape from Medusa's sisters and go on his way. As he's coming home, he comes across a girl named Andromeda who has been sort of like chained to rocks as a sacrifice for, it's not important, we'll talk about it another time, I guess. He ends up like marrying Andromeda and rescuing her. He comes back home and he uses the Gorgon's head to kill Polydectes. And also, in a roundabout way, this isn't going to be about Perseus, so I don't want to go into like incredible detail about it. In a roundabout way, causes the death of his grandfather and thus fulfills the prophecy, blah, 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 whatever. He becomes king. Huzzah. We're all happy for this. And then Athena takes the head of the Gorgon and puts it on her shield and uses it in battle. Uses it to stop people in their tracks, to instill fear in all of the people who see her. Medusa is kind of a small part of a much larger myth. Medusa is barely mentioned in a lot of these myths. So let's kind of go back now. Let's do the mythography that I said I was going to do. So where I'm usually like always going to start is with Robert Graves. Robert Graves, he's written a ton of mythology. He tends to be the person that I go to the most when I'm looking at things, right? So Robert Graves in his book Greek Myths says, children of Keto and Phorcys, the three Gorgons, dwellers in Libya, were named Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, all once beautiful. But one night Medusa lay with Poseidon, and Athena, enraged that they had bedded in one of her own temples, changed her into a winged monster with glaring eyes, huge teeth, protruding tongue, brazen claws, and serpent locks, whose gaze turned men to stone. So it's kind of like a lot of different versions that you see with this. He claims that the Gorgons were representative of the triple moon goddess, wearing prophylactic masks with scowl, glaring eyes, and protruding tongue between bared teeth to frighten strangers from her mysteries. He then goes on to say that the names of the Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, mean strong, wide-roaming, and cunning one, respectively. And these are titles of the triple moon goddess, and some people historically would call the moon the Gorgon's head. According to Robert Graves, ancient Greek bakers used to paint Medusa's head on their ovens to scare people away from opening it and ruining the bread, which, as someone who like just started making sourdough, I think that I will do that as well. There you go. That's what Robert Graves has to say about it. Let's find out what everyone else kind of has to say about it. So the first time that we really see Medusa mentioned is by Homer, right? Homer was the great author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he only really mentions her in passing. In the Iliad, he talks about Athena's shield. He talks about how he says across her shoulders she threw the betasseled terrible aegis, which is shield, all about which terror hangs like a garland, and hatred is there, and battle strength, heart-freezing onslaught, and thereon is set the head of the grim gigantic Gorgon, a thing of fear and horror. He later on kind of describes it in a little bit more detail in the Iliad, saying that it was a stark shield, a thing of splendor. There were 10 circles of bronze upon it, and set upon it were 20 knobs of tin, pale shining. In the very center, another knob of dark cobalt, and circled in the midst of all was the blank-eyed face of the Gorgon. With her stare of horror, and fear was inscribed upon it, and terror. The strap of the shield was silver upon it, and there was also on it a coiled cobalt snake. And there were the 3 heads upon him, twisted to look backwards, and grown from a single neck, all 3. The next time you kind of see it, her mentioned, so that was in like the early to mid 8th century BCE. The next time you see her talked about is by Hesiod. So in that episode that I did like forever ago, where I talk about like why myths are super confusing, I talk about him a little bit. He's the one who wrote the Theogony, which is sort of like the story of the gods, right? He writes all of these histories about the world and mythologies, and he's just this big poet. He writes about her in like that first part of the myth that I told you about, of like her parentage and her siblings. But in his version, he does say that, at least according to translations of his work, that she lay with Poseidon in a soft meadow surrounded by spring flowers, which sounds super romantic and not like Poseidon at all in literally any other myth. But this is one of those things that people sort of go back to say like, actually, according to this source, they laid together and it was totally consensual, right? And then he also talks a little bit about how Perseus wore the sandals of Hermes and, you know, like flew around with her head in a bag, right? There's not really much more to it that he kind of talks about. The next time we really see Medusa being mentioned is by Euripides in the play Ion. So Ion is about Creusa, I think is how you pronounce it, and Ion. So this is from the 5th century BCE, so 200 years after Hesiod and Homer were writing about Medusa. We have this from Euripides. So Creusa was raped by Apollo and got pregnant. She ends up abandoning the baby, and the gods take him to Delphi. This is where the oracle is, and he's like raised there. But a few years later, Creusa is married to Xuthus. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's spelled with an X, which is always confusing for me. And the priests of Apollo give her Ion, telling her that he's actually Xuthus' son. But she figures out later on, and it's cool. Like before she knows that this is actually her son, she ends up trying to kill Ion with Gorgon's blood. So this scene takes place between Creusa and an old man. I haven't read the play, so I don't know how significant he is. But in this scene, I found that he's regarded as an old man and later referred to as an enslaved person. So they're talking about Titanomachy and how the earth goddess produced the Gorgons, described as an awful monster who was created to harass the gods and help the Titans. She said that the Gorgon was killed by Athena, who now wears her skin like a fucking Buffalo Bill skin suit. And then she talks about the 2 drops of Gorgon's blood. And with the 2 drops of Gorgon's blood, they can poison or cure. Apparently, Athena gave 1 of each to her ancestor on a necklace, and it was passed down to her. So now she wears it on her wrist in 2 separate little vials. For good and evil do not mingle. From what I read, this is a really interesting play because it really kind of shows like female rage, right? In that she was raped and then made barren afterwards, which I didn't mention. And then is forced to raise what she believes is her husband's illegitimate child. But it ends up being her child because the gods are tricky and she tries to kill him. And it's like this whole joke the gods are putting on her. So I might at some point actually look into this more, maybe do an episode on it, or maybe just read it for my own kind of shits and giggles that I see. But there's this interesting dynamic here of the Gorgons being old, kind of changes their original story. The Gorgons being ones that are helping the Titans, which if you are following this like Titanomachy story of the Titans versus the Olympians and all of that, you have this whole thing of like the good guys versus the bad guys kind of. So by putting them with the Gorgon, or putting the Gorgons with the Titans rather, you've put them on like the wrong side of history, if you will. And then saying that like 1 drop of the Gorgon's blood can poison and 1 drop of the Gorgon's blood can cure is a really interesting dynamic that you start to see coming up around this time. And it's something that is sort of referenced at the beginning of the Medusa Reader, like I had quoted. The next time you see her is by Palaephatus, which is in the 4th century of BCE. And it goes completely left field of the Medusa myths. This is the first one where you see Medusa mentioned, and she is not like the myth that we know and love. So this apparently states that Medusa was a strong queen, and Perseus was a pirate, and that the Gorgon was actually a giant statue of Athena and not Medusa herself. And she is never turned into a monster. So it sort of tries to take this whole idea of myth and this whole idea of what some would consider like historical or whatever, of these fantastical god stories, and turn them into reality. So it says that Phorcys, her father, which is pretty much like the only thing that aligns with some of these myths, was an Ethiopian who ruled over 3 islands and had 3 daughters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, who each shared an eye, which kind of seems to be like conflating the Gorgons and the Grey Eye. Phorcys built a statue of Athena that was 6 feet tall, and he called this the Gorgon, but died before he could dedicate it to Athena. And then the 3 daughters each agreed to take an island that they ruled as queens in their own right because they refused to marry. And they shared the Gorgon between the 3 of them, and also like still shared an eye, which they would like take out and like put on a boat and like sail to the next one, and like fucking Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. So Perseus, who in this version, like I said, is a pirate, is actually an exile from Argos. He steals their eye while it's in transit and refuses to give it back, which is very similar to that original myth that I was saying, and holds on to it until he tells them where the Gorgon is, and like also threatens to kill them. So Stheno and Euryale told him where it was, but Medusa refused. So he gave the eye to the other 2, the ones who were complicit in what he was doing, and then murdered Medusa. And then he cut the Gorgon into pieces, which is the statue of Athena, and placed the head on the front of his ship, which he then renamed the Gorgon. And this was like the skull and crossbones Jolly Roger that people would see and like quake in fear when they would see like the golden Gorgon head on the head of his boat, a ship, whatever. One day he arrived on the island of Seriphos and demanded money. They asked for a couple days and ended up abandoning the island, leaving man-sized stones in their place. And from then on, Perseus would tell people to pay up or beware, because the last people who saw the Gorgon's head turned to stone, which is a very interesting version of that story to kind of like make it not so fantastical, you know, make it more something that is based in reality. I find very interesting. The next time we see Medusa really mentioned is by Apollodorus around 100 BCE. So it doesn't really say much about Medusa other than she was immortal. It mostly focuses on Perseus. Like I said, most of the time she is just sort of like this background character in the story of Perseus, or in the story of Athena, or in the story of Poseidon, right? She's kind of like a secondary character, which is interesting that she's created so much love for her character, right? So the only thing that it really says about Medusa in Apollodorus's version is that Perseus approaches her and her sisters while she was sleeping, and then he cuts her head off because she was the only one that was mortal and therefore was the only one who could die. He puts her head in a bag, and then from her decapitated body, Pegasus the horse and Chrysaor emerge, who she was impregnated by Poseidon with. Then her head is used for Perseus's revenge, and later on inserted into Athena's shield. So it described the Gorgons as having heads twined about with scales of dragons and great tusks like swines, and brazen hands and golden wings by which they flew, and they turned to stone all that beheld them. It also does say that Medusa may have been killed for Athena's sake, that the Gorgon was fain to match herself with the goddess even in beauty. So I find it really interesting because you have basically the myth, right? This is the first time that you see the outline for what the Medusa myth becomes, right? That version that I told at the beginning and the whole laying out of everything. This is sort of like the first version that you see this, and it's Apollodorus. Medusa has been written about for over 600 years at this point, and Apollodorus is the first version that we really see that is similar to the myth that we still tell today. But I find it really interesting in that she's described as a beauty, and that Athena wanted her killed because she was so beautiful. And yet at the same time, she's described as having tusk like swines and being relatively unattractive. And there is a version of the Medusa imagery that you'll see where she is looking like this. You know, there's a large round head with tusks coming up. It kind of almost looks like an orc, like a fat orc face, right? With the tusks coming up under the bottom and the large nose and the wild hair that is snakes, and that becomes like a protection symbol, a patropaic symbol, right? Which is really interesting to me. So the next time that you see Medusa is by Diodorus. Diodorus wrote about her about 50 years after Apollodorus wrote about her. And it's another one of those like history ones, right? Another one of those like, it's not quite mythology, it's history. He says that the Gorgons and therefore Medusa were actually North African. He spends the first half of this section where he's talking about them, giving a whole background to like the Amazons, blah, 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 blah. Eventually a woman named Marina is crowned queen of the Amazons and raises this huge army and decks them out in armor made of snake skin, which offended on behalf of Medusa and my ball python, Monty. Yes, I named my first ball python Monty Python. He has no limbs, but he tells me it is just a flesh wound. Okay. Which actually isn't totally true because ball pythons actually have vestigial feet. Fun fact for you. Anyway, so the Gorgons were people that were also led by women and super courageous and warlike, which naturally meant in this women-hating women misogyny coming from the inside of the house, world wage war against the Gorgons, right? They were pretty evenly matched, and even after the war, the Gorgons still held great power until Medusa took the throne and Perseus came and killed her and conquered their land because, quote, it was a thing intolerable to him, who made it his business to be renowned all the world over, to suffer any nation to be governed any longer by women. So, you know, anti-women in charge slander coming at you from 60 BCE. So the next time that we see Medusa is from my beloved Ovid, my beloved, if you will, which is in like right around the turn of the millennia, going from like BCE to the Common Era. He wrote most likely in like 43 to 17 BCE is when he wrote this. So this one goes into a little bit more detail. So I'm going to kind of like tell the whole story that Ovid kind of lays forth. Again, it is mostly the story of Perseus, and Medusa is just like a subplot that allows him to achieve his goal. I don't like Perseus, so in this version, I'm going to be depicting him as a fuckboy because that's all I can see him as. So in the Ovid myth, her head is referred to as, quote, the wondrous trophy, which is shoved into a bag, right? And as Perseus is like flying back home after he decapitates her, he flies over Libya and her blood will not stop dripping from her head. And every place that a drop of blood falls in Libya turns into a viper. And that is why snakes are in Africa or whatever. Like, that's the mythology behind it, I guess. So while Perseus is flying around, he needs to take a break. He comes across Atlas. Atlas, the dude who literally like holds the sky away from the earth, right? Like, that's his job. Like, on his shoulders, he holds the sky. And that is what stops the sky from crushing the earth beneath it. And Perseus is like, hey, dude, like, can I take some shelter here, man? Like, I just kind of like need some shelter. And Alice is like, no, I've never met you before, you random dude. I don't trust you. Considering I have a very important job here, I would like you to stop distracting me so I can stay focused. And Perseus doesn't like that answer and pulls out Medusa's head and turns Atlas into stone, saying, quote, big as he was, Atlas was all at once a mountain. Beard and hair were forest, and his arms and shoulders were mountain ridges. What had been his head was the peak of the mountain, and his bones were boulders, and now the heavens were held up by a mountain. After he murders Atlas, he's flying over Ethiopia and he sees a naked girl chained to some rocks and crying. And he comes to her and learns that her name is Andromeda. And he's like, hey, baby girl, the chains that should be binding you should be love knots rather than shackles. And now I know that Perseus is into bondage, and that's something that I didn't need to know. Like, I didn't need to know this. So he comes across a girl who is like crying hysterically, chained to some rocks, actively trying to shield herself from him, but unable to because of being chained to the rocks. And the first thing that he says to her is a kinky comment about how he'd like to tie her up in a loving sexual way, not this way. And you find out that she is there, shackled to the stone, because her mother spoke too much about the beauty of Andromeda, right? And you can't do that. You can't speak up the beauty of a mortal, right? Because then you're trying to elevate them to the gods, and you're just going to be punished for it. And in return of her mother talking up Andromeda's beauty, the Nereids, who were sea nymphs, got really offended, and Poseidon sent a sea monster to wreak havoc. And they've kind of come to the determination that if they sacrifice the beautiful Andromeda, if she is killed by the sea serpent, then Poseidon will let off, right? And so once again, someone being punished for something that they didn't do that was the fault of somebody else, which is a common theme in mythology. So this is like, you see this in the Cupid and Psyche myth. That's like the first myth that I really did that got me into like wanting to do mythology for this podcast. Happy Valentine's Day for that. If you want to go back to listen to it, it was 3 years ago today that I uploaded it, and it's still one of my favorite episodes of all time.
Editing Christina here. Hi, I'm a fucking idiot. I'm so caught up with the thinking about like that it's Valentine's Day that I just immediately think of Cupid and Psyche and not about the fucking myth that I'm talking about today, and thinking about how Andromeda and Medusa are parallels and also foils in all of this, in that you have both of them who are being punished for being beautiful and both of them being punished for things that didn't happen to them, and yet you have Medusa who's being killed by Perseus and Andromeda who's being rescued by Perseus, which I think is a very interesting commentary of everything that's happening and the involvement of the gods and the curses of the gods. And didn't think about mentioning that when I was recording this. So yeah, anyway, back to real time, Christina.
So just like that one, they're punishing Andromeda for speaking of her beauty. And even though it's not her fault, she's still the one who's going to be hurt and potentially killed by it. So they chain her to a rock to be eaten by the sea monster, right? So I guess like Andromeda is there and her parents are nearby crying over the fact that their daughter is about to be eaten by a sea monster. And Perseus is like, why the fuck are you crying? Like, I don't see the point of you crying. So like, why the fuck are you crying? But like, don't actually tell me why you're crying, because like, I don't care and we don't have much time. But like, I know that if I were to come here as a suitor, quote, I, Perseus, son of Jove and Danae, conqueror of the snaky-headed Gorgon, the daring flyer through the winds of heaven, you would give me Andromeda. Like, if I came here as a suitor, you would have been like, oh shit, this man is the fucking goat. Like, of course we need to just like give our daughter to him. And he's like, so like, yeah, if I rescue her, can I have her? Like, will you give her to me? And they're like, sure, yeah, you can have her if you can rescue her, and we'll also give you like our entire fucking kingdom. Like, could you just make it so that our daughter doesn't get eaten by a sea monster? And he's like, bet, yeah, totally. And so he does the stabby stab and he does the killy kills and is given Andromeda for it, because remember, this is mythology and women are property, right? But before he fucks her right there on the beach, like with no, like parents might still be watching. I'm hoping that they walked away, but he's like, great, she's mine now, gonna fuck her immediately. I know that she just had a traumatizing experience, but I am hard. Okay, but before I go and do that, I'm just gonna take a little bit of a bath. Let me put down this sack with Medusa's head in it. That's still bleeding, by the way. And he's like, well, I can't just like put it on the sand because that might ruin my trophy. You know, the island that he was just given for rescuing a woman. That might ruin my trophy if I put this on here. It might turn the whole island to stone, and we don't want that to happen. So he like gets sticks and twigs and leaves and like puts Medusa's head on that, which is still dripping blood, and all of the blood that it drips on it turns the sticks into coral, which can be found even today in the ocean. So that is the origin story of coral. Also comes from Medusa. Then Perseus goes on to tell the entertaining dinner story about how he murdered Medusa. So he's like, yeah, man, somewhere deep in the mountain lived two sisters who shared an eye between them. And by this, again, I think he means like Euryale and Steno, conflating the story with the gray eye, like a lot of these stories have done so far. That he went with the intention of stealing the eye for some reason. Ovid does not elaborate. He just like popped in his head one moment, like, you know, it would be fun if I were to like steal their eye and not give it back. Like, that just sounds like a really fucking banging time over here, right? So he like steals their eye, and then like he goes with like the intention of stealing their eye, and he goes to the Gorgon home, which is in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rough wood and jagged rocks, which to me sounds like Medusa just wants to be left the fuck alone. But no, all these men gotta come and fuck with her shit and try and kill her, right? So as Perseus is making his way into this like cave that Medusa lives in, this whole walkway is just cluttered with marble men and animals that were made this way by just a single glance from Medusa. He then walks into her cave using his bronze shield as a mirror so he wouldn't be able to make direct eye contact with her, but she was sleeping, and like a coward, he decapitated her while she was sleeping, and from her decapitated body came Pegasus and Chrysaor. He goes on to tell more of his exploits, which I don't care about. And someone is like, yeah, whatever, that's cool. But why was Medusa snake-haired? Like, do you know why Medusa was snake-haired? And Perseus is like, oh yeah, that's actually a cool story, bro. Because she wasn't always like that. She was actually once really beautiful, like the most beautiful, like the most fuckable person that you've ever seen. And her most notable feature was actually her hair. And then one day she was seen by Neptune, which is Poseidon if you are in Greece, who raped Medusa in Minerva, or Athena if you're in Greece, in her temple. And Minerva/Athena turned away, hiding her eyes and her outrage until she could contain it no longer. And she, quote, punished the outrage as it deserved by turning Medusa's hair into serpents. And even today, quote, to frighten evildoers, Minerva/Athena carries on her breastplate metal vipers to serve as an awful warning of her vengeance. So it seems like Ovid is the first person to really specify that Medusa was raped by Poseidon. The only other time that we really have seen this part of the story thus far is from Hesiod, and Hesiod says like they laid together romantically in a field, and then she was punished for it, right? And so like in the Hesiod version of the myth, her being punished by Athena makes total sense. Athena is a virgin goddess. Athena requires all of her priestesses to also be virgins, right? So if consensually Medusa has decided that she's going to go fuck Poseidon, it makes total sense that Athena is going to punish her for it. But Ovid, who is the source of most of these popular myths, right? Most of the myths that we know and most of the myths that we quote tend to be by Ovid. And he is the one who says specifically that she was raped by Poseidon. Which I think is just like an interesting kind of take. So to continue on with the Ovid myth, other stuff happens with Perseus. I don't care about him, so I'm not going to talk about it, at least at this time. Um, the only part that really has to do with the Medusa myth is that after he tells his story, this whole like battle erupts in the dining room between this guy named Phineas, who is Andromeda's uncle, and also the man that she was betrothed to before she was chained to the rocks to be eaten by a sea serpent. So her uncle slash fiance is like not happy that Perseus has married Andromeda, and everyone in the room starts to take sides, and Percy's like, oh shit, I'm not gonna be able to fight for long because I'm not as great as I think I am. And so he's kind of like, here I call upon my enemy. If any friends are here, you better look away now. And he pulls out Medusa's head and starts turning people to stone. One of them is like, go scare someone else with your magic, and then is like immediately turned into marble, and a couple other people against Perseus by Medusa's decapitated head, and probably still bleeding head. And Phineas is like, you know what? It ain't that big of a deal. You win. You can have her. Like, it ain't that big of a deal. I really didn't even fight that hard when she was sent to be sacrificed. I can live without being married to my niece. I was already planning on it, right? Because she was going to be dead. Your claim is better than mine. You fought more for her, and the best man has won. Now, please put away the stone marble making head, and let me just walk out of here, and we'll never need to see each other again. And Perseus says, quote, dismiss your fear, great coward. I can give you a great memorial. Not by the sword are you to die. You shall endure for ages, be seen for ages in your brother's household. A comfort for my wife, her promised husband, who's also her uncle, his very image. And then he pulls out Medusa's head again and turns Phineas into marble, and he is forever frozen in this begging position for his fiance slash niece to see forever. Ava said that Phineas is cringing, but honestly, like, I'm the one who's cringing after reading all of that. So let's briefly and swiftly move on, okay? So the next time that we see the Medusa myth is about 100 years later, written by a guy named Lucan. Lucan was writing in like the 60s of the Common Era, like literally like 60 Common Era, who he was involved heavily in a conspiracy against the Roman Emperor Nero and was forced to commit suicide for it. But he wrote that Medusa was West African. He says that she lived in West Africa where the ocean meets the hot earth in a wide, untilled, treeless region, which she had turned entirely to stone merely by gazing around her. That she had serpents for hair, and she loved to feel them gently caress her. He writes that her snake hair curled close to her neck and down her back, but it was short in the front like bangs, which had become very fashionable style in Rome. It said that when she brushed her hair, poison would flow from it. He then goes on to say that the quote-unquote luckless Medusa couldn't look at anyone. If they did make eye contact with her, they wouldn't even have time to recognize what was happening by the time they were petrified to stone. He then goes on to talk about the other creatures that have serpents for hair. Quote, a sight of the Furies' serpent locks causes simple madness. And when Orpheus played his lyre in the underworld, he glanced unharmed at the serpents of Cerberus's mane, which presently ceased hissing. Hercules, too, was able to decapitate without danger the serpent heads which sprouted from Hydra's neck, but Medusa was dreaded even by her own father Phorcys, Neptune's second in command, and by her mother Keto, and even her sister Gorgons, because she had the extraordinary power of paralyzing everything in the sea, in sky, or on earth by turning it to stone. Birds suddenly grew heavy and crashed to the ground. Beasts stood frozen on their rocks. Entire tribes of neighboring Ethiopians were transformed to statues. No living creature, in fact, could bear to look at that face, not even the serpents on her head, which explains why they curled back from her forehead. He then goes on to say that she's the one who turned Atlas to stone, not Perseus, and was used by Athena to turn the snake-legged giants into mountains, and then explains how Athena orchestrated the murder of Medusa and then theft of her head. Like, I don't even know what to really call it. But after Perseus kills Medusa, he travels around with her head a little bit and then gives it to Athena, who now wears it on her breastplate. So Perseus had been sent by Hermes for some reason. The source doesn't state. And Athena saw him and Hermes's golden winged sandals and knew that he was on a quest. So she figured out what it was that he was doing and then told him that if he promised to give her Medusa's head, she would teach him how to kill Medusa. She then gave him a bronze shield and told him that when he reaches Libya, he has to fly backwards through Gorgon territory and use the shield as a mirror so that he wouldn't get turned to stone. When he arrives at Medusa's, he doesn't even need to worry about it because she's sleeping, like so many of these other myths that we've put in place. And even though some of her snake hair tries to protect her, he has no problem whatsoever decapitating her. Perseus then goes back home through Libya, whose soil was sterile and fields unproductive, but they sucked up the blood of Medusa's decapitated head, and from these drops of blood came snakes. The first snake that came, because the blood was so potent, produced the asp, which was the deadliest snake. The next time you see her mention is in passing. So Lucian, in like the 1st century going into the 2nd century of the Common Era, states that just like the sirens lure people in with their song, the Gorgons lure people in with their beauty. He says, quote, Perseus has done the daring deed, but has not looked except at the reflection of the Gorgon in the shield, for he knows the cost of looking at that reality. Pausanias, around the same time, describes Medusa as a Libyan warrior queen who was killed by Perseus and decapitated in order to show off her indescribable beauty to his fellow Greeks, and then her head was buried in Argos. So, like, literally, Pausanias says that he just like walked around with her head to show people how pretty she was. Like, you could have just had a picture made of her. Like, I know that there weren't cameras in the 1st century, but like there were paintings. You could have just had someone do a painting of her instead of walking around with her decapitated, rotting, bleeding head, but whatever. And then we don't really see anything about Medusa for the next like 300 or 400 years. The next time you see her is in the late 5th, early 6th century by Fulgentius. I don't know. I'm really bad at pronouncing these old names, guys. Just deal with me. This is where you start to see them looking to the past and coming up with theories and making commentaries on these very well-known stories. So at this point, Ovid is 500 years old when Fulgentius is writing. And he's like, Ovid and Lucan have done this story to death. We all know it. I'm not even going to talk about it. Fulgentius is also Christian, so he's looking at everything through that lens. So this is also where we start to see like that transition into Christianity, which I think is really interesting because you don't think of myths being told and retold and like manipulated and translated in a way that fits a narrative. Oftentimes you just like think of the myth and that's it, but myths are retold and changed over time. So this is actually a really interesting kind of study. Don't expect me to do this with every myth. I refuse. But Fulgentius is another one that says that Medusa is actually a queen that's really powerful, who is so cunning that her head is snake-like. And the tale of Medusa is an allegory where manliness and wisdom destroys terror. So he goes on to say that Medusa was a queen. Her father was a king who left his daughters wealthy and rulers of land. Medusa was the most successful and was able to grow her wealth because she was a great cultivator and she specialized in husbandry. Fulgentius says that the name Gorgon actually comes from the Greek word Georgi, meaning husbandman. He also goes into what he thinks is the background to the Gorgon names besides... based on the ancient Greek as well. So he says that they are symbolic of the 3 terrors that one can be afflicted by. So he says that steno comes from the Greek word steno, which means weakening. And by that he means weakening of the mind. I have no idea what he means by Euryale, so I will just quote him directly and hope that one of you beautiful and smart people will understand better than me as I write the script after midnight. He says, quote, second Euryale, that is a broad extent. Whence Homer said, Troy, with its broad streets, which is apparently the terror that fills the mind. I think something is lost in translation and it's all Greek for me. And then for Medusa, we have Medusum, because no one could look at her. And he says that she was said to have a snake-like head because she was so cunning like a snake, like I said. Perseus was Greek and coveted her land, so he decapitated her for it and then stole her land and flew away, by which they actually just meant that he sailed away at great speed with his face averted, because he's a manly man who handles manliness, who never even considers terrors. And the reason why he holds a mirror is because terror is reflected not only in the heart but in the outward appearance. He also says that Pegasus, the winged horse that's said to have burst from the decapitated body of Medusa, wasn't actually winged. It's fame that's winged. And therefore, it means that Pegasus was really famous and therefore a symbol of fame. But Pegasus was still born from the blood of the Gorgon because the Gorgon is fear. And by the Gorgon's head being attached to the breastplate of Athena, goddess of wisdom, we can say that either wisdom is born when fear is ended, or that fear is the beginning of wisdom, because wisdom grows from fear of its master. And when anyone fears fame, he grows wide. Does that make sense? Are you high enough to understand this? Because I am swiftly realizing that I am not, and I am moving on. Okay. So the next time we see Medusa mentioned is by John Malalas in the 6th century. This one is really different. And the last that we really see from like the ancient world, like the before medieval time period. So he says that Perseus's father was someone named Picus Zeus, and he died. And Perseus was really jealous of his uncle Minos of the Minotaur fame and went to the oracle, who sent him to Libya, where he came across a virgin country girl with wild hair and eyes who said that her name was Medusa. And then he grabbed her by the hair and cut off her head and performed a spell over it that was supposed to help him against all opponents. And then he made his way to Ethiopia, where he met another virgin girl named Andromeda, who was living in the temple of Poseidon, and he raped her and married her, forced her to marry her. Then he went to Assaria and Cilicia, conquered the whole city, because the oracle told him that he could, and then sacrificed an innocent girl named Parthenope to, quote, purify the city. He then conquered the Assyrians by killing his own family member, and then renamed them the Persians and taught them the awful magic that he did to Medusa and led them into naming their land the land of Medes. Soon after that, Andromeda's father, Cepheus, didn't like everything that he was doing and declared war. As Cepheus is attacking and approaching, Medusa's head is held up by Perseus, not realizing that Cepheus can't see. So he thinks that Medusa's head is no longer working, looks straight into her eyes, and is turned to stone and was killed. And Medusa's head was burned so that it could never be used again. And while that version is sad with all of the rape and women death, I do like that it ends with Perseus just fucking dying. And I wish that all of the myths ended that way. So like I said, there's like 700 years in between this. People kind of fell off looking back at myths, right? So during that time period, like the Dark Ages or whatever, that's not my historical time period, so I know very little about it. During that time period, you have this whole like growth of Christianity, and in that, you know, not wanting to look back towards the pagans and not wanting to look back towards anything that isn't like Christian or whatever, right? There are far too many other things going on with all like the Crusades and shit that come up after a while, and all of the religious wars that happen. So the next time that we see Medusa is by Petrarch. So Dante in Dante's Inferno, there's like a random comment about Medusa, but it's not important. So the next significant time that we see is by Petrarch, who was a medieval poet and author. He was one of the first professional authors, and he was the poet laureate. He is a big deal historically. He became obsessed with classic myths and finding the original versions of these myths because he was trying to be the most accurate. Now, he didn't really write about Medusa so much, but he did sometimes use these myths to influence some of the poems that he wrote. So, in Petrarch's Sonnet 197, he talks about how he's in love with a woman named Laura, who turned him hard like the marble Medusa turned people into, if you catch my drift, okay? He also talks about how Laura's beauty is like Medusa, specifically her beautiful curling hair. And that's about it. That's about all that we see from him with Medusa. But this whole idea of like turning a man hard and becoming sexual, we unfortunately see later on in the 20th century, which I'm already dreading getting to, but we're just going to kind of breeze through these next few. So Corruccio Salutari in the late 1300s also talks about Medusa's beauty and how it was her eloquence, specifically in speech, that would make people like stone because they would just be so stricken with her that they forgot how to move or how to even breathe. But the book that I was reading about this points out that it was a misunderstanding of her father's name, which he took to mean to speak. So he also said that it was Jupiter or Zeus who had Medusa's head on his shield and that they shared an eye, which they didn't. So he just like wasn't as obsessed with finding the true source of myths as Petrarch was, and kind of bastardized it, like you see a lot of people bastardizing myths all the time when they don't actually like read the original. Like I said, I'm just gonna like breeze through these next few because they're either like talking about Medusa in the same kind of way, or she's just like mentioned in passing. I'll make sure to talk about the instances where she's written by really famous people, but we're kind of like getting out of mythology at this point. And while it's part of the story interpretation, I don't really want to get into it that much going out of mythology. So Leone Hebreo, who was a Portuguese philosopher who spent a lot of time in Italy in 1535, takes on like a Christian tone, saying basically Perseus' defeat of Medusa was a defeat of earthiness and vice to spirituality and perfection. This kind of idea is also found in Natale Conti's work from the 1550s. Natale Conti was a poet, mythographer, humanist, and historian, also from Italy. He said that Medusa is symbolic of the, quote, pleasures that entice and control men. You also see this in John Harrington's work in the 1590s. John Harrington was an English author and inventor of the flushing toilet, in case you ever wonder. That is an English invention, apparently. He said that when Perseus kills Medusa, that he, quote, slayeth sin and vice, a thing base and earthly signified by the Gorgon, and that when he takes to the sky afterwards, it's actually him ascending to virtue and heavenly things. So this to me kind of like all three of these kind of combined, which were all from the 1500s, kind of screams of the ideals that you see in this time period. Now, this is my time period. This is the time period that I specialize in. So I feel a lot more comfortable saying the things I'm about to say. So you have the Protestant Reformations during this time period in places like Germany and Switzerland and England and France. I mean, like really all over the place in the 1500s. And then you also have the Counter Reformation, which is like a Catholic revival in response to the Reformation. So you have people, especially the Protestants, who are looking back into the origins of Christianity and quite literally going back to the beginning. When you first see Satan in the Bible, he is in serpent form and he is tempting Eve and by extension Adam. And what does Medusa have on her head if not serpents? So you start to see her being this like evil or like pagan-y kind of creature, or like the emphasis on how she is the earth or symbolizing the earth, and almost like a demon, if you will, who is tempting people that needs to be vanquished by the good and godly men. We'll ignore the fact that these good and godly men that they are talking about, like Perseus, would have been a dirty, dirty pagan as well, but we're just going to ignore all of that. You see her talked about a couple times in the 1600s, Francis Bacon being one where he basically like uses her story to talk about war. The next time you really see her being talked about a lot is in the 1800s, which makes sense because during this time period we have the romantic poems, and they're kind of also like going back and looking at myths and writing this real flowery language. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote Faust, which is a really popular piece of literature about like selling your soul to the devil. Medusa is mentioned in passing like a temptress. Percy Bysshe Shelley writes about her in a poem that was posthumously published by Mary Shelley, who just has my entire heart. An interesting one that I came across was when Karl Marx wrote about Medusa. Yes, the writer of the Communist Manifesto. One of the big things, to boil it down to like literally the most like basic and elementary things that he was for, is that he hated capitalism, and he wrote that Medusa was capitalism that stops progress and she must be vanquished, but people are like Perseus and are always like hiding behind something, which I'm here for the Perseus slander. Nietzsche mentions her as like a shield from Dionysus, and now we get to the moment that I have been dreading. Sigmund Freud wrote about her in the 20th century because using Oedipus and Electra wasn't enough. We have to bring Medusa into this too. Hold on a second. I need a moment before I get into this. So Freud is talking about the decapitation of Medusa and says to decapitate is to castrate, right? So the terror of Medusa is thus a terror of castration. And this happens when a boy who is, quote, unwilling to believe the threat of castration sees female genitalia for the first time surrounded by pubic hair, and that vagina most likely belonged to his mother, which just makes me really uncomfortable, especially being a mother of a son. But I'll hold off on those thoughts to continue getting through this. So he continues on to be like, Medusa's head turns men to stone, therefore stiff with terror. And for a man to become stiff, that means that the man is erect, and by gazing upon the terror of Medusa and the terror of castration, it makes him hard to let him know that he still has a penis. And he continues on because, again, life is nothing but eternal suffering. And he goes on to say that Medusa is a priestess of Athena and therefore constantly wears the robes of a virgin and repels sexual desire since she has a vagina like your mother. And the Greeks were, according to Freud, mostly homosexual, and therefore it makes sense that they would be terrified of a woman. Listen, if I had to read these things, then you have to hear these things, okay? He then says that the vagina is arousing this horror when isolated from the pleasure-giving aspect of the vagina, and it is apotropaic in doing so, which is just like a fancy name for repelling evil. So basically saying that it is so horrific that as it meets the horrific, like the horrificness of the vagina as it meets the horrifying things that you come through life, they cancel each other out, like that one story by Rebellious where a woman showed the devil her vulva and he ran away in fear. But the penis is also apotropaic because to display the penis is, and I quote, to say, I am not afraid of you. I defy you, for I have a penis. There are more authors and poets that have written about Medusa, but I think I'm done with that for now. I finished Freud and I closed the book. I closed my laptop and I walked away. So let's talk about Medusa in popular culture today. Okay. She's made quite a few appearances, or like there have been a lot of characters that have been inspired by her. So there was like Sedusa in the Powerpuff Girls from the 90s, Mike Wazowski's girlfriend, whose name I can't remember, Cecilia, I think, and Monsters Inc. is like a Medusa figure. There's the Percy Jackson movies, and probably in the books. I've never read the books, so I can't say for sure. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, the show Wednesday on Netflix. She's in video games like God of War and Final Fantasy and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. There's even a Monster High doll inspired by her. But I think one of the biggest things that she is known for right now is from TikTok, which I have a love-hate relationship with. But it started to become like widely circulated and known, the meaning of the Medusa tattoo, which symbolizes the whole story of her mythology. It's mostly taken as a reclaiming of her story and has become like a symbol for those who have been sexually assaulted. And this is kind of where my love-hate comes to. Because I am someone who has wanted to get a Medusa tattoo. I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm not going to go into details of my personal life and things that have happened to me. But I'm just going to say I am someone who identifies with the meaning of a Medusa tattoo. And so the love side of it for me is that people are discovering her story and finding strength in her story. But at the same time, it has also caused me to feel a certain way about it. And this is just totally my opinion. You can disagree with me. But this is just my opinion. Because when I first decided that I wanted to get a Medusa tattoo a really long time ago, it was because first and foremost is because she is a badass mythological figure. And the sexual assault is a part of her story. But to me, she was always a symbol of strength. It was something that was done to her that she had no control over, that wasn't her fault, that she never received justice for and would never receive justice for. And yet it is something that would never happen again, right? There's a part of her story that I think is really sad. She is sexually assaulted and then betrayed by the person that she loves the most and worships, and then turned into a monster by that same being that she loves and worships, literally devoting her life to Athena, who then turns her into a monster. The very beauty that defined her is stripped from her. And afterwards she goes into seclusion and people still try to attack her and harm her until she is betrayed again. And even in death, her body is used without her consent. And when I think about her myth in that way, it breaks my heart. But that is never how I like to think about her myth. And that's never the part that I focused on and the part that I love. All the basics of the way that I look at it and the way that I love it are still the same, right? She is raped. She is betrayed. She is turned into a monster. She goes into seclusion and people, mostly men, still try to harm her, and she defends herself. And in defending herself, finds strength. And that shit ain't ever gonna happen again. To the point where there is a literal fucking graveyard of men, of the people that have tried to harm her. Just the pathway to her is a graveyard of the men who have tried to hurt her. Something awful happened to her, and the strength that she finds in herself gave her the ability to literally stop the people who sought to hurt her in their tracks with a single fucking look and become so strong that the literal gods fear her. And even after death, she continues to have her strength and is used as a symbol of protection to those who wield the emblem of Medusa. They will never be harmed and will stop those who want to harm them in their tracks. And that is why I wanted to get a tattoo of Medusa, and why I still might. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. But I am not defined by something that someone else did to me. I am defined by my strength. And if you are going to tell me that I am a monster, then I will become the monster that you feared, and I will take pleasure in doing so. And the part that I have issue with is that is not how popular culture is depicting her, especially around this tattoo. They are defining her by something that was done to her. She is defined by probably the worst thing that ever happened to her, other than her murder, and not the strength that she took back and the power that she had. And I've seen TikToks and Instagram reels and social media posts made by tattoo artists reenacting someone coming in and saying they want a Medusa tattoo and then pitying the client because of what was done to them, or people saying like, if you see someone with a Medusa tattoo, know that they were sexually assaulted, and it's actually really sad, and that is not the fucking point of Medusa. And to boil her down to that is missing the fucking point of Medusa. Because in almost every version that I have talked about today for the last almost hour and a half, Medusa is a strong woman. Medusa is a strong presence. Medusa is a force to be reckoned with. Medusa is someone who is feared even by the gods. Medusa is so powerful in her way that the only way that you can stop her is to murder her. And some of these paint Perseus as a really bad guy. A lot of these stories paint him as the hero, but in many stories, he's portrayed like a villain who killed a strong, powerful person for what, right? Like, she is a powerful being who is not defined by the fact that she was sexually assaulted. She's a powerful being that's not defined by the fact that she was turned into a monster. She's someone that like finds strength in it, kind of, you know? So I think I'm kind of just going off the cuff at this point. So I think that that's kind of where I'm going to stop for today. I hope that you liked this deep dive into Medusa. I hope it wasn't too dry at some of those points, kind of going through all of these different like historical things surrounding Medusa. But if you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And remember that Medusa is a badass bitch. Okay, bye!